welcome to the Arabic Hour. My name is Ghanwa Hakim. On today's program, we focus on Syria with our guest, Dr. Hugh Roberts.
The fundamental fact about the opposition is its lack of coherence, and I think that the extent to which it has come under external sponsorship is actually the single most important reason for that lack of coherence. That the rebellion initially was a relatively ragged affair. What needed to happen is an internal dynamic of unification amongst the forces present on the ground inside Syria. And the moment external powers, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the West, the various Western powers, started pitching in, this basically neutralized any internal dynamic of unification and growing coherence, and has simply led to an endlessly reproduced incoherence.
Professor Elaine Hagopian interviews Dr. Hugh Roberts on the current state of affairs in Syria, with a focus on understanding the key internal and regional players in the conflict, and the U.S. and President Obama's administration's position on how to handle Syria. Dr. Hugh Roberts is the Edward Keller Professor of North African and Middle Eastern History at Tufts University. He holds a Ph.D. from Oxford University in history. He has taught at numerous prestigious institutions and was a senior research fellow at the London School of Economics. He has lived and worked in Egypt and Algeria, conducting research on Algeria, Egyptian political history, and the history of Islamism in North Africa. He also worked for the International Crisis Group as director of its North Africa project. We would like our viewers to note that this interview was taped on September 8, 2013, before the Russian diplomatic initiative to put Syrian chemical weapons under international control.
Thank you, and we have with us Hugh Roberts from Tufts, and again we welcome you to Arabic Hour, and today we want to talk a little about Syria. Mostly we want to talk about what is Obama up to and why does he want to bomb Syria, but in order to give our audience a little bit of a background in terms of the actors in Syria at this point, can we identify who they are? Do you have some thoughts about the Free Syrian Army, the Muslim Brothers, the Jabhat al-Nusra, the more jihadist group? Do we have any idea who these people really are and what their goals are?
Traditionally, the Muslim Brothers were the main source of opposition to the Assad regime for a long time, going way back to the 70s.
Yes.
And of course, they were the main player in the violence that occurred in the late 70s and early 80s, pursuing a belligerent strategy, not a peaceful one like their Egyptian counterparts, because
they are different than their Egyptians, even though they're the offshoot of the Muslim Brothers.
Well, the reason for the difference was that they were dealing with a different regime, a regime that was not cutting them any slack at all.
That's right.
Given that it was an explicitly secularist regime. But since the onset of the rebellion against the regime 2.5 years ago, it seems to me that the brothers have lost ground to some extent. That they were, as you know, prominent in the political apparatuses set up as notionally representative of the opposition to the Assad regime.
And that political apparatus was the Syrian National Council.
Syrian National Council,
which was sponsored by the U.S. and France and Western. They're mostly expatriates.
But
Muslim Brothers were highly represented in that.
Yes. Clearly, they have lost ground in terms of the armed movements, and as these have become less coherent over time, this has, I think, been an increasing problem for the Muslim Brothers. As I understand it, the Free Syrian Army relied initially on quite a lot of defectors from the government's armed forces. But of course, that may have been defectors who were already, in some sense, in sympathy with the Muslim Brotherhood. That there may have been a degree of infiltration or
that seems in some ways to be the case.
Yes. And then, of course, there's been the effect of extensive external intervention, particularly from the Sunni Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and so on, funding armed movements. In part, of course, from the Saudis' point of view, in order precisely to deny to the Muslim Brothers any effective hegemony over the rebellion against the Assad regime. Saudi Arabia wants the Assad regime to fall, but doesn't want the Muslim Brothers.
But does not want the Muslim Brothers to actually, yes.
And it seems to me that the most striking thing about the whole rebellion against the regime and the opposition to it is how it has completely failed to cohere. And that a lot of the reports we're getting are reports about infighting and rivalries within the rebellion. I think it's difficult, if not impossible as things stand, to make an accurate assessment of where this leaves the brothers now. They have, of course, they're deep-rooted, they're tenacious, but they seem to be unable to take significant initiatives in the current
Yes, and this is what is so puzzling, I think, for many people, because you do have this Free Syrian Army. There may be some defectors in it that were leaning towards Muslim Brothers anyway, but they thought the Free Syrian Army was going to be supported by the West, and that they would really have a chance. And then they always talked about the Muslim Brothers as though they were separate. And lately the mainstream media doesn't even mention the Muslim Brothers in Syria. And then you have the more radical elements, the jihadists, that initially seem to be funded by Saudi Arabia. But they are well funded in any case, and they come in from every which way. And no one really knows how these three parts of the opposition actually work. We know the Jabhat is organized. We know the large group of Muslim Brothers that seem to have lost some initiative. But they're not gone. Are they in the Free Syrian Army, or have they joined the Jabhat al-Nusra? This is what is confusing.
I suspect that on the ground there's quite a lot of diversity. That people, whatever their original political or ideological orientation, are choosing to side with whoever is locally strong. In quite a few cases, and I think that. What this is in a sense a vicious circle now. It seems to me to be quite a well-established vicious circle over quite a long time now. That the initial lack of coherence of the opposition,
yes,
or the notionally representative political or civilian wing of the opposition, permitting continuing incoherence or conflict, diversity on the ground amongst armed groups, and then this feedback logic developing that just reproduces the situation.
Right, and I mean, one of the reasons why the Syrian National Council, which was started almost immediately and had many people from the U.S. and France and Europe in general, seemed to have disappeared, is because they didn't have coherence filled with Muslim Brothers. They were unable really to establish their credibility on the ground, and they were unable really to provide a framework for the Free Syrian Army as sort of the civil authority, the state authority, exile. And so we found that last year in Doha, Saudi Arabia, after a kind of palace coup in Qatar, because Qatar favors the Muslim Brothers, where the emir theoretically resigned in favor of his son. That's a palace coup. It was under pressure from Saudi Arabia, from the U.S. probably. And they put in their own guy, and they marginalized the Muslim Brother content. And that's when Muslim Brothers seem to have lost power or initiative in Syria as well. They put in a very pliable person, Ahmad Jarba, who allegedly, according to the Al-Akhbar newspaper, was headed a brothel in Damascus and was a drug dealer and was responsible for some assassinations and so forth. Anyway, he is head of this now Syrian National Coalition, of which the Syrian National Council is a member, but is no longer dominant. And the U.S. got everybody that they could, the major powers, to recognize that as the legitimate sole legitimate representative of the Syrian people. Theoretically, they're supposed to have some sort of control over the Free Syrian Army, and they're supposed to look like they're coherent. That hasn't happened. And you know, can you tell us a little bit about why Saudi Arabia seems to have thrust itself as a major exposed player through the Syrian National Coalition? Why it's thrust itself in that? We knew it was a major player anyway because of its funding, but why is it now a part of this sort of political scheming that isn't working?
Well, I think, first of all, the fundamental fact about the opposition is its lack of coherence, and I think that the extent to which it has come under external sponsorship is actually the single most important reason for that lack of coherence. That the rebellion initially was a relatively ragged affair. What needed to happen is an internal dynamic of unification amongst the forces present on the ground inside Syria. And the moment external powers, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the West, the various Western powers, started pitching in, this basically neutralized any internal dynamic of unification and growing coherence, and has simply led to an endlessly reproduced incoherence. That's a general point that I think is actually really quite an important one. So far as Saudi Arabia's motives are concerned, it seems to me, I don't have privileged access to Saudi policy thinking, but it seems to me fairly clear they have two concerns. They have always been hostile to the Assad regime, in ideological hostility to Baathism, but above all hostility to the regime because they see it reasonably as an ally of Iran. The Saudi attitude to the Syrian crisis is predicated on the unresolved Iran problem and what that means for Saudi Arabia and the other Sunni monarchies of the Gulf. And at the same time, of course, the last thing they want to succeed Assad is the Muslim Brothers. So they have two goals: topple the Assad regime, but prevent the Muslim Brothers from being the beneficiary. And that meant that their strategy is one of intervening very vigorously and funding armed groups not affiliated to the Brothers. And that in practice means groups of like Jabhat al-Nusra that are effectively close to or similar to or affiliated to Al-Qaeda.
Yes.
And the West has sort of gone along with that, very remarkable fact. And this is a strategy, of course, that is leading to endless mayhem, but does not hold out any promise of any kind of effective successor regime to the Assad.
No, and this is I mean, you know, it's clear that Saudi Arabia really is concerned about Iran and the alliance with Syria and Hezbollah, and they also see its relationship to Iraq since the Shiite-dominated government.
Sure.
And there are Shiites on the eastern coast of Saudi Arabia.
That's right.
And Saudi Arabia is not an anti-Western country, as theoretically the alliance is supposed to be. So it has that as a main element. What is questionable is what do they think is going to replace Assad? I don't think they really want the Al-Qaeda groups to be dominant. Because they also are unhappy about the pro-Western views of Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's just like you know, what happened in Afghanistan. But they got this guy Ahmed Jarba in the Syrian National Coalition, and I think they're thinking of somehow that some elements from this and some outlet with their Islamists who are more in keeping with Saudi Arabia's view of that it is a nationalist state, it's not an ummah state, that they may try to put them in, and which is why they filled this coup in Doha. That's speculation on my part. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, they don't seem to have any idea of what they want afterwards, if they get rid of Assad.
Well, My thoughts about that, and as I say, I can't pretend to read the Saudi government's mind on this, but what strikes me is that in pursuing their dual objectives of toppling the Assad regime but ensuring the brothers don't benefit, where this is leading, given the way other external players are in some sense going along with it and supplementing it, it's leading to the scenario of either simply an endlessly protracted civil war, given that in military terms the Syrian government has clearly got the upper hand over the last few months, and it's not certain that it will lose it, whatever America now does. I mean, that's the variable about to happen, if you like. Or that, in fact, Syria as a political unit will be destroyed. And that that's something that it may well be that Saudi Arabia, which is after all some distance away, doesn't have a common frontier with Syria, may be comfortable with Syria being destroyed.
Having a broken down Syria where the Kurds go...
Kurds go one way, maybe a little Alawi statelet in the northwest.
That's right. Idlib goes more towards Turkey. The Idlib province, which is where the Muslim Brothers are.
The point, however, is that that scenario may leave the Saudis indifferent, but it won't leave the Lebanese indifferent, or the Turks, or the Iraqis, or, for that matter, Jordan. I mean, all Syria's neighbors stand to have enormous and protracted headaches if the Syrian state breaks up, and that includes Israel. So one wonders, there's evidence that there is a line of policy thinking in Washington that is comfortable with the idea of the breakup of Syria, and possibly also in London. But one wonders whether this actually has been thought through properly by the real decision makers in Western capitals, because the fallout of the breakup of Syria could be
It's enormous. I mean, it's just enormous, and I think no one has given that really important thought. Before we leave the internal actors, I think no one seems to mention a particular organization, particular political grouping, and that is the National Coordination Committee for Democratic Change, which is on the ground, and it is a coalition of former Syrian parties and so forth. It never favored foreign intervention, and many of its leaders are popular. Now, in some ways, its critics from the recognized opposition by the West say, well, they're really pro-regime. On the other hand, the coordinating committee would say, well, these people are pro-Israel, pro-West, and so there is this kind of battle. But it does have significant presence on the ground. It's just not doesn't have military control, and it had never really believed in military action. And it was probably a lot of the people who are in it were part of the original authentic nonviolent movement, because I find a lot of the nonviolent movement people favor that group. That's not even part of the equation in discussion, in public discussion in the West as a solution. Do you have any observations on that?
Well, I can't help thinking that this is, in that respect, a partial replay of the logic of the Libyan story, because there was, at the outset of the rebellion against Gaddafi, an important and initially influential current within the rebellion against Gaddafi that did not want any external intervention, that was opposed to NATO or Western powers getting involved, that wanted to be able to take a sort of patriotic nationalist position and hold that against Gaddafi's claims to be to have a monopoly of patriotism and so on, and wanted now, in a way, of course, that current in Libya was very quickly marginalized the moment the West got involved, and that was the end of it. In Syria, as you say, it's still there, although it's getting no coverage. And the logic of its position, of course, is that the violence is, of course, enormously costly, not only in human terms, but to the social fabric and to the whole prospect of any kind of reformed Syria. And that their position is that they are the element of promoting a reformist vision that it should be possible for the regime to negotiate some kind of...
They were willing to be in dialogue with the regime.
And the regime has
yes.
said many times
Yes.
it's willing to dialogue about change,
Yes.
but not with rebels, not
Yes.
with,
Yes.
with an armed movement.
And the interesting thing is that they never advocated getting rid of Assad. Of late, they have basically said that they would like to see a democratic transition in which, he is sort of voted out or legally retires in some fashion. But they are not advocating, military action against him.
Can I make a point
Yes.
about Assad? I mean, this another aspect of the situation that I think Western discussion, commentary has completely failed to take into account is that Assad is not really a dictator. The regime is an authoritarian regime,
Yes,
and
yes.
of course it's been dealing in a brutal way with the rebellion.
Yes, yes.
Not that one can think of many states that are not brutal with rebellions. But within the Syrian state, the president is not able to impose his will. He has to negotiate with other powerful... There are centers of power. The party, the intelligence services, the army, and so on. And Bashar al-Assad is not in a position to lay down the law to these. He's, as presidents of authoritarian regimes go, he's in a relatively weak position. A bit like Algerian presidents in Algeria, where both states are really oligarchies rather than autocracies.
Well, that's right.
And that means that the West's aim of getting rid of Assad wouldn't actually get rid of the regime necessarily. It might actually make it even more difficult.
Stronger.
Well, it would make it even more difficult to secure a transition to something better.
Well, and this is why, and I mean, I agree with you. I think Assad is really sort of one among many. He has to negotiate, and he came in as a weak president. I think he has, in this recent things, he's gotten a little more power, but he really doesn't have a lot of power. In the about a year or more, actually more than a year ago, Manaf Tlas, one of the generals and the son of a defense minister who was considered to be a little bit cuckoo, and Manaf was a friend of Bashar's. He defects, and he goes first to France, and then he goes to Turkey, and then we heard he made a trip to Saudi Arabia. He looked like he was being primed to take over the army. The U.S., looking at what they did in Iraq by sort of immediately getting rid of the Ba'athist Party and the army and so forth, it was chaos. They wanted someone to actually dominate the army, the regime, and they thought Manaf Tlas was it. They were also looking for someone in the political area to defect. And they had Riyad Saif, and they had a few other people who defected, ambassadors and whatnot. And they never found an agreement to actually put them in. Now, are they saving them, or saving Manaf Tlas as possibly a replacement in the regime as head of the security and the army, and could he do it? That's my question. I mean, do we know anything about how they would try to control the army, the regime, the security forces in Syria, should they get rid of Assad himself, which I'm not sure they're going to be able to do?
Well, let's remind ourselves that up until now, all the Western powers have ruled out any kind of ground troops being inserted into Syria. And we should also remember that, of course, the Security Council of the United Nations is divided on this whole question. It seems to me that what they succeeded in doing in Libya, in some degree, parachuting into post-Gaddafi Libya, people cards they'd had up their sleeve for quite a while, or parachuting into the rebellion and then further into the post-Gaddafi regime. That was premised on the fact that there had been this effective military defeat by NATO, including ground troops, The idea that there weren't ground troops is false. There wasn't an occupying force because it didn't stay, but there were ground troops and significant presence giving influence. That so far seems to be ruled out. Now, a big one question is, does what the United States have in mind to do include a change there? But if it doesn't, then I think that the idea of being able to graft onto a sort of decapitated Syrian army a sort of favorite Egyptian that is being held in reserve, favorite Syrian, I beg your pardon, being held in reserve, that looks more like wishful thinking than a plausible strategy.
It is. My own sense is that, and we'll get to Obama now and why he wants to strike Syria, is that they don't really want to get rid of Assad. They just see too much chaos. But they would like a weakened regime, and they would like a stalemate between these forces. The Israelis are interested more in sending a message to Iran by having this strike in Syria. I mean, I don't think the issue really is chemical weapons or the Syrian people or anything else. So the Israelis are lobbying for this. The Saudis really do want Assad to go. And Turkey is biding its time. It's very, it attacked Assad and then it can't backtrack. But let us talk about why is Obama so determined, or seems to be determined, after being so reluctant to do anything about Syria? Why is he now running around Congress and trying to whip up things? And did he go to Congress because he really wants them to say no, he wants to back out of this? What is your best guess? Or you may have contacts in Washington that I don't have. Why was he trying to do this? I mean, everybody looks at it as a fault. Well, it affects his whole domestic agenda, which is more important to him. What do you think is behind this?
I can only speculate here.
Yeah, we can all only speculate. I don't think any of us know.
I can't help wondering whether. I mean, he's been criticized quite a lot in certain quarters for exceeding his constitutional prerogatives in the matter of making war. There was at least a line of criticism that he was in violation of the Constitution over the Libyan affair.
Yes.
So I think that's an element in his calculus, sensitivity there. I think a second element is sensitivity to examples set elsewhere, and I'm wondering whether the fact that the matter was dealt with in London in Parliament
that seems to
made
have
him
had an
feel.
impact.
I think it must have done. I think it made him feel, well, if the British refer it to Parliament, whatever the outcome, that makes me even more vulnerable if I don't refer it to Congress.
Yes.
Whatever choice I make as to my desired, my preferred policy at this juncture. So there are those elements, but I can't help thinking that the fundamental element is an inhibition to take the steps actually required to resolve this Syrian drama in the best way. Because quite clearly there's an impasse on the Security Council, and the point is that the real interlocutor for the United States in this matter, if it wanted to resolve it in a way that would do the US credit, is of course Moscow. Now the question that I ask myself is, given that there's clearly an element in Washington that saw that, and we had John Kerry going to Moscow on May the 7th or 6th or 7th, as I recall, early May, and an agreement to have a second round of the Geneva negotiations as soon as that could be arranged. What happened to that idea? I think that if we're looking at what's going on now and what the choices are, we should remind ourselves that another path was somehow sabotaged. It looked to be opening up in May. An agreement between, at least a provisional agreement in principle between the US and Russia, that they would together be the godfathers of a serious negotiation.
And each promised they would bring their parties to the table.
Even
though the coalition people are saying, you know, we won't come unless there is going to be a new government, a temporary government followed by elections.
Now,
but he said, I'll bring them.
Well, the Syrian government announced that it would attend.
Yes, the Syrians did. The regime did.
Why didn't the U.S. manage to emulate the Russians in bringing their side? And it seems to me that here again one is speculating, one is reasoning about from the available evidence. It seems to me that the great difficulty that Washington has had and has failed to overcome, there may be two elements of it, but one element clearly is the difficulty of persuading the Saudis to agree to get its proxies, whoever it's funding, all the armed groups it's funding, to accept this. And it seems to me that that is related to the failure of the US to grasp the nettle of resolving the problem of Iran. And given that going to war with Iran has been apparently ruled out, certainly the position of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs, and they're being very sane in my view.
Absolutely.
If you've ruled out some horrific war scenario, then the alternative is, of course, serious negotiation. The Iranians have signaled that they're open to serious negotiation, that their new president is a very different character from his predecessor, as someone who is looking for a compromise. And it's what's striking, in my view, is that Washington's failure to see that opportunity, make the most of it, and deal with what is at the root of the Saudis' position on Syria. Their understandable anxiety about Iran.
Yes.
And that leads me to think that what is actually required in this part of the world now, in the Middle East narrowly defined, is something much more ambitious than an attack, however big or small, on Syria, but actually an approach to developing a new security pact that covers the region, that actually provides guarantees for the Gulf states in relation to their intimidating Iranian neighbor, but also provides the Iranians with guarantees. And that is something that Washington doesn't seem to have even thought about. But if it were to think about it, it would recognize that its main partner in this would be Moscow.
I mean, in the end, it has to be these two parties that find some way to do this.
That's right. And what is happening, in a sense, I see it as being a whole series of short-term, knee-jerk, emotion-fueled, media-pressured spasms of ploys, mostly violent ploys, that are simply happening because what needs to happen isn't being undertaken.
You are watching an interview with Dr. Hugh Roberts on the analysis of the Syrian crisis, described by many as a proxy war, bringing regional and international interests and powers to the Syrian front. As a reminder to our viewers, this interview was taped on September 8, 2013, before the Russian diplomatic initiative to put Syrian chemical weapons under international control. We will be back with the remainder of the interview after this short program ID.
You are watching The Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
It's a very puzzling, I mean, I don't see Obama as being stupid in any way, and yet obviously he is not, his focus was on his domestic agenda. He just didn't want any more wars. As he said, I wasn't elected to start wars, but he somehow is being pushed. Tell me, what is the role? I mean, the Saudis are one threat, and this is why I say the Saudis and the Israelis seem to cooperate. I think the Israelis not only want to send a signal to Iran, but in some ways they'd like to create a stalemate in Syria where you equalize the forces and they just keep fighting, and hopefully it can contain it. But I don't think the Israelis really want to see chaos if Assad goes. They don't want. They are concerned. They're concerned about any kind of spillover into Israel. But what do you see? I mean, AIPAC is running around in Congress, and not all American Jews support the AIPAC position. The neocons have resurfaced. I mean, you know, Crystal and Kagan and these people all come out of the woodwork. McCain is pushing for more power against Syria. But what, and they support the Israeli lobby on this. The Syrian task force, which has been created to lobby for the Syrian coalition and works with the Washington Institute and AIPAC, they want the intervention. They want to strike a more. But what is the Israeli goal? What is this drive? And is there some other factor related to either Saudi Arabia or Israel that is driving the U.S.? Example, before you answer that, let's just say one thought is the Israelis have been pushing for bombing of Iran for years. I mean, you can go back to a speech by Netanyahu in 1996 in the Congress, in which he again raised Iran and nuclear, and the time is short and so forth. They have been pushing for the U.S. to bomb Iran, its nuclear facilities. The U.S. has said, no, let's try sanctions. Netanyahu had to pull back. But Netanyahu always said, well, we need to take care of our own security. Was Netanyahu more recently saying we might bomb Iran, in which case the U.S. would have to come in it? And is this a measure that Obama is taking that, you know, sort of hit Syria and tie up Iran and Hezbollah? What is that even a possible speculation with some feet, or is it not?
Well, on Israel, don't forget, Israel isn't monolithic in its outlook. There's been some very, very senior people in the Israeli army and intelligence community who've spoken out in a very vigorous way some months back, saying that the idea of going to war with Iran was lunacy.
Yes.
And they were very emphatic, and they were people with a good deal of authority. Given
and who
their
think that
experience.
Netanyahu is cuckoo strategically?
One should, I think one needs to learn how to take the discourse of elected politicians with a grain of salt. It depends on, one should always bear in mind what audience is he or she addressing. Maybe an internal one. It should be perhaps discounted by external audiences a lot of the time. That applies all around the ballpark. But I think that given the failure of the US to find a way of resolving through in the only way it seems to me it can be satisfactorily resolved, through an extended negotiation, the issue of Iran's nuclear program, given this is seen as carrying a threat of a military aspect to it. And the only way it seems to me that can be resolved through negotiation is a negotiation that involves Russia as the external guarantor of Tehran's commitments. And that requires security guarantees to all the players. Given that that hasn't happened, and it seems to me that that is really a failure on the part of statecraft on the part of the US. Maybe no one has been canvassing this idea in Washington, but it seems to me that it's logical and rational for Israel to want to weaken Iran by weakening its Syrian ally without wanting to go too far. And the question is, can what is being envisaged in terms of military strikes be measured accurately? There's always the so-called law of unintended consequences. I think that we should be very concerned at this moment in human history, in the history of the region, but it's also the world, given Russia's implication. We should be very worried about whether or not the people making the decisions are making accurate calculations, or whether there isn't a degree of recklessness in creeping in.
That, of course, is very important to recognize. But so
the other aspect, if I may, because you asked about what else may be happening, and I don't think one should. I think there's a tendency in the U.S. not to see the role and influence of other Western players, namely Britain and France. France, of course, is the old colonial power.
Yes.
Syria was a French protectorate.
Yes.
And my reading, I can't pretend to be to have recent, fresh information from Paris, but my reading of the French attitude, whenever there is a question of the U.S. engaging in some new military move of a large kind in relation to the Middle East, France and Britain want to be involved because they see this as leading possibly to a new deal of the cards,
that's right.
and they want to stake their claim to whatever,
Yes.
to part of the dividend.
That's right.
And this logic, which is the logic of the game played by the Western powers with each other, which is partly complicity and partly competition, all the time, leads to influences emanating from those two capitals, London and Paris, particularly, of course, London, in the case of the US, entering into the political arithmetic in Washington. And that's why I think that the example of Mr. Cameron referring the matter to Parliament and then having to at least say that he would abide by the decision of Parliament not to get involved in a military operation, that's something that has almost certainly influenced President Obama's recent moves. So I think that there is a problem of the United States President actually being subjected to a possibly unbearable degree of pressures emanating from all over the place and being in effect pushed around.
Yes.
Pushed around by, I mean, one can't really fault any of the sources of these pressures. They're all governments defending their own state. I think it's all very cynical and it leads to human tragedy, but the point is that's the game. The problem is that the US hasn't a strong position of its own to defend. It's being pushed around by an assortment of other agendas, because it doesn't have its own strategic vision of what it should be promoting.
Yeah, and when he
so there's an absence
yes,
at the heart of this story.
And even though the European Union has said, at least they've said, that they think maybe Assad was responsible for the chemical weapons, which is really irrelevant. They said they would wait for the UN report, which is not going to tell you who did it if it was done. And France, which said it would go to war, has now taken on that position, especially in view of what the British Parliament did. So Obama is really left out in left field. The only strong supporters for this strike are Israel and Saudi Arabia for different reasons. And this is something that he finds difficult to stand up to, and I'm trying very hard. I think everybody's trying very hard to understand why he can't find a formula to get out of this, especially when there's the Geneva Conference idea. Or is he thinking, well, with a strike he might be able then to weaken the government and then get a better deal? Why is he unable? Is it just his whole
two things
nature?
Two things that occur to me immediately. One is the point you made earlier that he was elected mainly on his internal agenda. He's someone who came to the White House with no experience of handling foreign affairs at all, and that makes him, unfortunately, and I think it's very dangerous for the rest of the world, unfortunately tends to be the prisoner of powerful lobbies who do know what they want in American foreign policy to be and security policy to be. So we're talking about a president who, it seems to me, who hasn't had his own clear view of what US policy should be. And I think that's a very, very serious fact. And it is a serious fact that America puts people in the White House who don't actually know what they're doing in foreign affairs. It's more often than not, and who therefore are, in a sense, manipulated by powerful lobbies. I mean, this was true of the second Bush presidency. The other point is, I think the importance, at least let me suggest that one of the problems that President Obama has arises from the importance he attaches to his own rhetoric.
Yes.
Having talked about red lines, he could say, when there was this earlier story about sarin gas being used, with contradictory views as to who did it, he could say, well, it's not a big transgression of the red line. He could sort of get away with that. But this time, whoever did this gas attack, 1,450 corpses, I think that he's trapped by his own rhetoric. And his rhetoric wouldn't matter so much if he actually had his own positive agenda for sorting this all out, and he hasn't had that, and therefore his rhetoric traps him.
Do you have any thoughts on who did this yourself? I mean, there's really no proof in either direction. And when the American statement came out, it said with high confidence they attributed this to Assad. Well, Assad is not really the regime, as we have already discussed. And, you know, so they're not sure. The U.S. government is not sure. People have walked away from the classified meetings and still don't want to vote for this. Surprising but not surprising is Markey's present vote on the committee when they were discussing it in committee, in the Senate committee. And my own feeling is he is a knee-jerk Zionist voter, and AIPAC wants this, and yet he voted present. My own sense is that...
Sorry, he voted?
Present, just present. He didn't vote yes or no, he just voted present. But he still has yet to vote when it comes before the Senate. He's up for re-election in a couple of years. I mean, he's just temporary in Kerry's thing, and he will have competition, which he's never had as a congressman. And he knows that Massachusetts is against this. So that may be a factor, but others who who have been known to vote with AIPAC are coming out and not convinced by what they've seen and heard in the classified material. So there's still a question of who did this, and I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, given that the Syrian government was winning through conventional military means,
why would they do it?
And given that they had agreed to have inspectors visit, it seems to be quite extraordinary that they should have done this precisely at the time around the time of the visit. They didn't need to do it, and they had every reason not to do it. And given that the evidence doesn't point unambiguously, it's not nailed down that they did it. This is, at the very least, as the Scots would say, not proven. I am inclined to be very skeptical of the idea that the Syrian government did this. I would be even more skeptical that Bashar Assad had any say in it at all. We could be looking at some. I don't pretend to know what happened, but I think that the evidence available most certainly does not does not establish guilt on the point of the Syrian government. And I think that was this some sort of extraordinary accident? Accidents with chemical weapons could happen. Or was it a false flag operation by one of the enemies of the regime? A sophisticated intelligence movement?
It's a very real possibility.
It's a possibility. Particularly since there was, I recall reading a story, it's not a paper to which I had given an enormous amount of credence, but one of the main daily papers in London, in Britain, the Daily Mail, ran a story last January about how a false flag operation using chemical weapons in Syria to implicate the Syrian government by its enemies was being prepared. There was this story, if I remember rightly, it was January the 29th. Now, isn't that an interesting fact? And when one bears in mind the lies that were told at the start of all the other major interventions, the story, the myth of the Kuwaiti babies being slaughtered by the Iraqi forces in 1990, the hysteria generated over the supposition that Gaddafi was going to massacre everyone in Benghazi when there was absolutely nothing in his track record to warrant
indicate that.
I can't help thinking that we are looking at the warmongering faction up to its old tricks.
Well, I tend to agree with you. I mean, again, it has yet to be proven, but I think this was a false flag operation. Let me get you to think a little bit about the situation in Syria in terms of, and this is my last question, where is it going? I mean, at this point, the people who originally wanted Assad out, the authentic movement, are really saying we'd rather have Assad than what would come after. And so he's, we don't know because of our own media, but from other sources, he seems to be more popular, even though he has, not he, but his regime has been so determined that these rebels and the Muslim Brothers and the jihadists are not going to win. He's not going to, turn over Syria to them. And in his last interview with Charlie Rose, about 2.5 years ago, and Charlie Rose, before the whole outbreak, Charlie Rose asked him one final question. He said, "What is your greatest problem?" And he looked at him and he said, "Keeping Syria secular." That was his answer before this whole business started. So I think all the destruction that in retaliation, he is just he and whoever is around him are determined that these people are not going to win. So do you think if he does succeed, or he stays in, or it's a long run, will he be able to govern? Will he be able to govern Syria, or even a truncated Syria? Or will he be weakened, and Iran will help but maybe not be there as much?
This is a hypothetical question.
It is a hypothetical question. I'm just trying to...
The point is that we, as things stand, we're looking at a position where the violence is set to continue indefinitely,
yes,
with American and other players protracting it, and even perhaps in America's case doing so as a matter of policy.
That's right.
Which means, of course, that the external players are increasingly responsible for the death toll. That's a point that should be borne in mind.
Yes.
If this is being protracted because of the policies of external players, including the US,
yes,
then they are taking over more and more and more responsibility for the number of dead. And I think from that's a reason for thinking that it would be a tremendous mistake for America to do this, because America is already losing its influence in the Middle East.
I think it would be a huge mistake.
And it will lose more as a result. So, as and when the violence ends, let's put it like this. If there hadn't been this incident and there was no question of the US preparing to hit Syria in some way, big, small or medium or whatever, and the logic of what was happening up until a month or so ago or 2 months ago was continued, i.e. the Syrian government winning the war, winning the war, and managing to save the unity of the country, to keep Syria, to preserve the territorial integrity of Syria, there would have then, of course, been a huge political problem of reconciliation, of binding up the wounds of the society, and I'm sure that the Syrian government was perfectly aware of that. What do we have to go on? Well, there was a horrific civil war in Algeria, or what many people regard as a civil war, which killed more people than have yet been killed in Syria. And as soon as a way to end it was found, the Algerian government immediately embarked on a program of national reconciliation. Now, of course, that leaves quite a lot of people dissatisfied. But on the other hand, it does actually work in terms of re-establishing a functional unity of the national community. And I don't see why that couldn't happen in Syria. If the civil war was allowed to be resolved on the basis of the internal balance of forces, which have been clearly favorable to the government. But if, in fact, the US is simply going to join Saudi Arabia and the other external actors in preventing the balance of forces inside the country to resolve the conflict, then all bets are off. There's no knowing where this is going to end. And it may well end in a way that breaks the place up altogether with all kinds of horrible fallout across the region. There's no way of knowing what the Syrian authorities would be able to do.
What is interesting is that before all this happened, I mean, there was always discontent by the Muslim Brothers, you know, dating back to the late 70s, early 80s, and the massacre and all. Assad himself, with his entourage, recognized growing Muslim Brothers' discontent. What he was doing was he was allowing more Muslim schools to open. There was a woman who opened a school to train women in Islam, for example. Was allowing more mosques to be built. Was not putting in any laws that said you can't wear the hijab, because those began to appear more. So he is aware that he needs to give space. But this thing came and hit very quickly. And he has, at the moment, no space. But as you say, if he survives, or if his regime survives, they would have to have some reforms, obviously.
Yes.
But there is this capacity that could be employed again. Well, you've been very wonderful, and we hope that you will come back and continue our discussions and conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was an interview with Dr. Hugh Roberts, Edward Keller Professor of North African and Middle Eastern History at Tufts University, discussing the conflict in Syria and President Obama's position. Thank you so much for joining us. Some stations will be leaving us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. For those of you staying with us with the remainder of the hour, we hope you enjoy the last musical segment following the closing credits. On behalf of all of the volunteers here at the Arabic Hour, this is Ghanwa Hakim, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdullah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience. The American Arabic Benevolent Association, ABA, an umbrella association for community endeavors. The Nicholas G. Barham Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride. And by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.
لما صوتك ينده لي والبوس بتشن علي وتلج العخدودك حاري تعسل او سمعين انا بعد منه ومش فايق وميت عاشق قهوي عزمتني وعملك ركوي هو اطيب منها مش بايق انا اطيب منها لا 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 مش دايق لا 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 مش دايق لهجر قصرك وارجع بيت الشعر واعد لأهلي بعد ما دقت القمر لهجر قصرك وارجع بيت الشعر واعد لأهلي بعد ما دقت القمر وانسى